Okay, I think we should get started. On behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies at UH Manoa, I would like to welcome everyone to our Spring 2023 CCS webinar series, and today's session featured as a faculty roundtable and entitled Epigraphic and Archaeological Materials as Sources for Daoist Lived Religion. My name is Yu Mingbao Yu from the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures, where I teach 20th century Chinese literature, film, and culture. And I'm currently also serving as the CCS director and the organizer of this year's webinar series, with the kind assistance of the CCS Executive Committee and CCS Associate Director Ren Yomei, Dr. Cindy Ning. Please note that today's session is being recorded and the file will be uploaded to our CCS YouTube channel, where you will also find previously recorded CCS webinar sessions. Our fall program flyer for this semester can be found on the CCS website and Instagram, and you can see the links to all three media platforms now in the chat forum. Today's session is kindly co-sponsored by the Religion Department here at UH Manoa, and we would like to thank and acknowledge them for their support. Before I introduce today's moderator, who in turn will introduce our three distinguished panelists, allow me to quickly go over some procedure reminders. Feel free to use the chat forum for posting any technical or other queries, but use the Q&A tool for posting comments and questions to our speakers, which will be answered during the Q&A session. We kindly ask that you please keep your comments concise and ask no more than 2 questions so that we can accommodate everyone and keep within the 30 minutes we have allocated to the Q&A session. We will try to take the questions in the order they have been submitted, but we might also synthesize or group together similar questions so that we save time and make room for other comments and queries. We further reserve the right to dismiss comments and questions that are not relevant or civil in tone. After today's session, you will receive a brief survey and we would greatly appreciate your constructive feedback. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the organizer and moderator of today's faculty roundtable, Dr. Jonathan Pettit, who is an associate professor of Chinese religion in the Religion Department here at UH Manoa. Dr. Pettit received his PhD in 2013 from Indiana University and subsequently lectured at UC Berkeley and Purdue University before joining UH Manoa in fall of 2017. His research interests are focused on the production of Daoist and Buddhist scriptures, and his book entitled Library of Clouds, A Bibliographic History of Daoist Scriptures, was co-authored with Professor Zhang Daoran from Furen University in Taipei, Taiwan, and published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2020. CCS actually marked the occasion with a special book launch panel in our webinar series in November 2020. So for those of you who missed it, you can find a recording of this session on our CCS YouTube channel. So without further ado, let me turn over to Dr. Jonathan Pettit.
Hey, thanks so much, Mingbao, and thank everyone for being here this evening or this morning or this afternoon, wherever you may be. This is a very exciting time. Daoist studies at UH Manoa has been strong for 3 decades, so it's great to kind of carry this torch and bring this event and, along with our Global Daoist Studies Forum and other events that we have. The 3 speakers today are all working on a project that many of you already know about. And Dr. Gil Raz, our first speaker from Dartmouth College, will tell you a little bit about how this project came to be and kind of how it differs or expands our knowledge of the history of Daoism. So without further ado, please, Dr. Gil Raz.
Okay. Let me first share my screen. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be in Hawaii in some way. I wish we could go surfing after this, but at best I'll go sloshing in the snow. So first of all, thank you very much, Jonathan, for inviting all of us, and for Professor Yue Mingbao and Cindy Ning and the entire team at the Center for Chinese Studies. We're very excited to be here, especially I am speaking for myself. So let me start by explaining what we're actually discussing. So this is a project called Advancing Daoism, Epigraphic and Archeological Materials as Sources for Daoist Lived Religion. It's a project. It's a multi-year project supported by the Luce Foundation. It was first started in 2018. It was supposed to be over actually last year, but as you might remember, there were 3 years of interference, and so it's been now extended for a couple of years, which is good for us. So what is this project about? The study of Daoism and of religion in general is very often very much focused on texts, especially what are determined to be canonic texts. And different religions have different canons. But people are very much committed to looking at texts, especially philosophical texts, and analyzing them and parsing them and explaining very high-level questions. But very often, once we go out into the field, we realize that the big gap between those texts and what we actually see when we actually examine the actual lived religion as practiced by practitioners of this religion. Now, in the context of modern Daoism or any modern religion, ethnographers, anthropologists can go in the field and record and talk to people and sort of ask them, what do you do, and so on. But once we go a little bit further back in history, it becomes increasingly difficult to assess what exactly is it that people actually did as they lived their lives in religious ways. So what this project tries to do is to examine a whole range of epigraphic and archaeological materials as sort of as windows or mirrors into the actual practices as lived by Daoists from about the 4th, 5th century to sort of the 16th century towards the Ming. This temporal sequence is mainly determined sort of by how we think about Daoism and by the members of the team. And the locations are sort of throughout China. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So this is sort of the logic that sort of led us to establish this program. And so alongside myself, we have 4 main investigators. Professor Li Sung from Beida Art Institute. We have here one of his major books is The History of Chinese Daoist Art, but this is one of many, many publications, way too numerous to even list. And he really specializes in the history of art, Daoist art, but as art. Bai Bin, professor of archaeology from Sichuan University. Again, his main publication is this 6-volume Archaeology of Daoism that he co-published.
It must have been a very profound idea. Maybe wait just a few more seconds to see if
Did I just disappear from?
you disappeared for a little bit. I was like, you're back.
Okay, let me share the screen again. Am I back on?
Yeah. Yes, that's the right slide. Yes.
Right. So Bai Bin sort of does a sort of archaeological work, and the other 2 team members who will hear from today is Lei Wen, specialist in Tang history, mostly working on epitaphs. So he's got so many publications. I just chose 3 recent ones that fit into that particular space on a slide. Otherwise, I would have no. There's just too many to list. And Professor Richard Wang from Florida, whose recent book, expert in Ming Daoism, whose recent book on lineages will be the main source for today's talk. So these are the main members of the team, and we have a variety of, especially graduate students in China and a lot of other scholars who are involved in various ways in the project. Now, what is it that we're actually looking at? So, moving into archaeological and epigraphic materials, we mean, for example, tomb epitaphs, such as this one, the Tiantui epitaph, which was Yang Guifei's instructor, that Lei Wen had written about. That's where I got this particular image. He'd written about this previously. Or we were talking about the huge number of steles throughout China. This is the Tang Dynasty stele for Wang Zheqiao in Goshan. So materials of this nature. We're talking about archaeological sites, this kind of cliff face shrines, such as this one, Rensho in Sichuan, that has multiple niches with, each one with very interesting issues to examine. So if the previous slide was really a variety of texts, such as epitaphs and inscriptions, these kind of sites are really about images. So we have to sort of understand what these images are. We're usually not told what those are. So how to even think about them, what was their purpose? And so we're trying to map as many of these sites as possible. Another type of site are cave shrines. Many of them are located in Dazu. This is just one example called Nanshan. As you can see, these are extremely rich materials and very complicated imagery to sort of work through. And very often there's no real textual base for what we're seeing. Or more precisely, there are a variety of possible textual sources which probably contributed to a particular concatenation of imagery, but it's not a one-to-one correlation. So none of these sites are just illustrations of texts. Right? We have to think about them in another way. What was their purpose? Why were they created? What was their history? What was their particular context? So we are collecting as many of these artifacts, either single epitaphs, single steles, or whole shrines, whole cliff faces, and trying to sort of, first of all, present them properly and think about what they tell us about lived religion, that is why people created them and what they used them for. Just as a note, with our extension of our project and kind of reallocation of the funds, we now have a postdoc, Tyler Fizel, who's creating a great website for us, where all of these materials will be mapped and introduced. So stay tuned for the future on that. But what really triggered me to start all of this whole project was to think about statues, right? An emergence of anthropomorphic imagery, actual statues of Lord Lao, of the divine form of Lao Tzu. So this is one of these statues. This is from 583. So all the statues and stele that you will see coming up all have short or long votive inscription. That is an inscription on a statue, on the body of the statue, that says why someone has done this. So this is how we know this is a Lord Lao. It explicitly tells it's Lord Lao, and the iconographic marks for Lord Lao is that he's holding a fan. In his right hand, he wears a Chinese-style robe as opposed to a Buddhist robe. And very often he has sort of a tall Daoist cap, and very often he's bearded. And that distinguishes him very much from Buddha. And as you can probably tell, the original style of this kind of statuary is in fact Buddhist. And the question that I had when I began to look at these statues is, why did Daoists begin to create these statues? And the hint for that question, or a further elaboration of the question, is on another statue, almost from the same time. This is from 586. This is for another deity. This is for the celestial worthy of another Daoist deity. But what's important in this particular votive inscription, it kind of apologizes, kind of explains on the actual inscription, provides sort of a rationale for what they're doing. And the rationale is very strange. There's these boxes here marked lacuna in the text, but we can almost figure out what it says because it's kind of formulaic. So the ultimate Tao is tranquil, but without words, it cannot communicate its patterns. Although its transformation, it pervades everywhere. And this is a sentence, a highlighted sentence, I want you almost memorize this. Where without form, there'll be nothing to manifest its essence. And the idea, of course, is that Tao has no form. And obviously, the people making the statue know that the Tao has no form and have to explain why are they doing this. So the real question, the impetus for me in beginning this whole project was to try to understand why Daoists began to present Lord Lao, the form of Lao Tzu, the divine form of Lao Tzu, in anthropomorphic form. When and where did this begin? So first of all, what do we know about Daoism? A little bit we do know about Daoism, everybody knows. is that the great image, the Tao, has no form, right? It hides in the nameless. Or even more so in Tao Te Ching 14, we have this very famous sentences that cannot be seen, it cannot be heard, it cannot be touched. It has no substance. It is in fact a shape that has no shape. It is an image without substance. So several times in the Tao Te Ching, we're told that there is absolutely no way to present or talk about the Tao in any physical form or in any, it's completely ineffable. This is reiterated in the Tao scriptures that appeared later on within Taoist community. So one of the first texts we actually have from any Taoist community, from Celestial Master community, it is a commentary to the Lao Tzu, produced probably in the late 2nd century within the Celestial Master community, and commenting on the very line we just saw, the formless form, the substantial image. We're told the Tao is without, is subtle and hidden, it has no physical form. It cannot be known by the senses. And then it actually points to people who actually create forms and call them the Tao, and these are false practitioners, right? They give them colored clothing, names, appearances. So people are making some sort of statue, some sort of imagery, and they are condemned and criticized. They are false, and these are fabrications, right? The Tao cannot be known by the senses. It's without form or image. So a great emphasis on an inability to produce statues. This text was very important within early Taoist communities, and we have a whole set of precepts transmitted through the early medieval era. And one of these precepts: do not practice false arts or point to any shape and call it the Tao. Very specific emphasis on the inability and, in fact, the false practice of creating images. So this is another image from the time period. It's from the 5505. So we have several instances. Great liturgists, so Liu Shujing, for example, in the early 5th century, one of the great codifiers of the tradition, who writes in his abridged codes, telling us about what the oratory or the silent chamber in each household should hold. This is a central ritual space for every Taoist household, and should only hold ink and writing brush and a low table. And yet some people who follow vulgar customs place beds and seats and also statues in there, and that is simply wrong, right? So it's still in the 5th century we have this, and a little bit later, in the early 6th century, yet another great liturgist, Tao Hongjing, who codified the Shangqing scriptures in his own sort of space, sacred space on Mount Mao. He established 2 shrines, a Buddhist and a Taoist one, where he worshipped alternately. He sort of had both Buddhist and Taoist practices, and we're told explicitly that the Buddhist statues held shrines, while the Taoist shrine had no statues. So very clearly, most of the references, we have only very few references, but most of them in the early Taoist canon are negative towards statues. It's exactly the same time that Tao Hongjing is not having statues is when we actually have the first Tao statues appearing in central China. It is, however, in early 7th century when all of a sudden we have making statues part of actual ritual orthodoxy. This is probably the earliest text that tells us precisely how to create images. This 2nd chapter from this ritual code. And as you can see, it begins by actually quoting the Tao Te Ching. The great image has no form. It has no shape, right? Silent, you cannot actually hear it, right? So he's quoting the Tao Te Ching here, but he says, if you wish to visualize the truth, the Tao, and attach your thoughts to the sagely countenance, then you actually create images, and it's all in the aid of visualization techniques, right? So, and then this particular passage is followed by a long list and full description of 18 different types of statues you can create with great details of all the various characteristics and elements, iconographies of these statues. So suddenly in the 7th century, we have a full-blown tradition of orthodox statue making. So when did this happen? How did we move from complete condemnation, critique of statues to the creation of anthropomorphic imagery, although we're told in an actual text that tells us to make images that in fact there is no absolute form. So we have over 100 images preserved in a very particular location in China. They're all dating from about the 480s to about the 580s. The main sites are listed, appear here. They're only sort of northern Shanxi. This area is usually called Guangzhong. Sometimes it's called the Jingwei watershed, stretching from the suburbs of what would be today the suburbs of Xi'an, this area here. We also have very few, maybe only 4 or 5 in Luoyang, and a few more in this area here called Ruichang. So they're very concentrated in time and very concentrated in space. And I think what we see here is evidence for very local tradition that began to make statues of or anthropomorphic imagery of Lord Lao as a manifestation of the Tao. The early imagery was not freestanding statues as the one I showed you before. The early imagery was actually on steles, 4-sided steles, which merged Buddhist and Daoist imagery together. And the point is Buddhism and Daoism together. So this particular stele, was erected by the Shi family in 523. It's preserved today in Lintong Museum. This is just one sentence from a very, very long votive text that I can't go through all of it right now, but this is the key passage here, right? Thus come, that is the Tathagata, the Buddha, and a great sage, that is a form of Lao Tzu, are extensions of the ultimate worthy, and in fact, they are split forms, right? There's actually kind of equal. They're inner and outer relationship. The Tao and the Four, Tao and Buddha, are mesh in compassion and non-action, which might actually mean nirvana in this particular case, are one. So what you see here is a complete merger and somehow a presentation of Daoism and Buddhism as somehow equal, Buddha and Tao as inner outer facets of some ultimate unity. The stele itself, so this is the face, the Daoist face, you can tell by he's holding the fan here. On each of these steles, we have hundreds and hundreds of names of donors. The donors identify themselves as Buddhist or as Daoist, and sometimes as more generic community members. Plus, they also present themselves sometimes with full titles of ranks within the Daoist, or more sort of more administrative titles as well. So we can create a whole social history of these practitioners as community, and also as communities are kind of merging Buddhist and Daoist. In this particular case, they're almost all surnamed Shi. So it's within one single clan, we have some who are identified as Buddhist and some identify as Daoist. In another example, so this is, if you unravel this 4-side stele, you can see this is the Buddha side, this is the Daoist side, and here you have the many names of the various donors. And the full inscription of the votive description is here. We only looked at one line for this description. This is the full, this is still sort of a short version of the full text. This is what we already looked at. You can see it's also—
Gil, down to the last couple minutes here.
Okay, all right, I'm moving very quickly. Another example, this is a Buddhist, identifies as a Buddhist, but he also puts up a statue of Shakyamuni as well as Lord Lao, again, sort of mixing Buddhism and Daoism together. And this particular stele tells again a very, very particular sad story of just one single person, a woman, who is somehow initiated into Daoism. She calls herself disciple of pure faith, and she's doing this for her husband. We have a whole set of this kind of steles, smaller size steles put up by individuals for deceased family members. So you have large groups, small groups, and you can tell stories of each one of these steles, which gives a sense into the lived religion of this community. So what I mean by lived religion is really a focus on individual or very small groups' usage of the universal category of religion, of, say, in our case, Daoism. It's everyday experiences and practices, expressions, interactions that can relate to religion, right? It's an approach that privileges local agency tells us about what the locals are doing. And while very often these kind of practices are seen as somehow derivative or deviant, what I'm encouraging our group to think about with lived religion, it's actually, we look at local religion as not as derivative or deviant, but actually as a site of innovation and of creativity. And what we're seeing in this particular instance, and I think we see the case the same in every one of our examples of other speakers today, it's a lived religion of a very particular local Daoist community with a very particular set of practices in which they have a very particular vision of Daoism and Buddhism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So our second speaker will be Dr. Richard Wong of the University of Florida. Dr. Wong, if you want to share your screen and take the floor. Great. Can other people hear? I cannot hear it.
I see it.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, now, yes.
So, shall I start? Or
Yes, go right ahead.
okay. So Gil already mentioned the theoretical foundation behind the lived religion. I talk about Daoism in the Ming Dynasty at the local level, but this topic is about the local religious tradition and their interaction with the imperial institution. The close interface between the imperial institution and the Daoism in the Ming Dynasty is a topic that has drawn attention, even though the number of publications on it still remain few. So my book is a result of such a concern. Daoism play a significant role in state religion. As it well known, the divine music abbey, Shen Yue Guan, was a state Daoist ritual agency in the Ming. The court of imperial sacrifices, Taichangsi, was a superior unit to the divine music abbey. The posts of its officials and the clerks were thus largely filled by the Daoist priests from the divine music abbey, known as musician dancers, Yue Wu Shen. The divine music abbey was also closely related to the Ministry of Rites. The court of imperial sacrifices, as the superior administrative unit of divine music abbey, was filled with many Daoist priests as its official and staff. The divine music abbey was also closely so with their expertise in ritual affairs, especially now that the state ritual was carried out by the Daoist musician dancers, some court priests gained privileges in their career pattern or promotion path, monopolizing not only the positions in the court of imperial sacrifices, but also some of those in the Ministry of Rites. In Liu Yonghua's words, the Daoist musicians and dancers of the Shen Yue Guan control the court of imperial sacrifices and increasingly penetrate to the Ministry of Rites. In the Ming, from the reign of the Jingtai Emperor to that of Jiajing Emperor, 6 Daoist priests were appointed ministers, and at least 5 became vice ministers at the Ministry of Rites, arguably one of the 2 most important ministries, the other being the Ministry of Personnel. This all-sized presence of Daoist priests in one of the 6 ministries, the administrative core of the central government, is unprecedented in Chinese history. Many works on Ming history or history of Daoism attribute this phenomenon to the emperor's personal patronage of Daoism. This view, to me, is superficial. Daoist priests from the divine music abbey to the Ministry of Rites had a promotion path or pattern. As to the rationale of this pattern of path, the satisfactory explanation, in my view, can only be acquired from the perspective of the state institution. The civil servants of the Ming government can be classified into two groups: a relatively small corps of Confucian literati who had passed the civil service examinations, and a much larger number of sub-official functionaries. Civil officials were recruited and promoted on the basis of academic merit instead of executive knowledge or capability. That is, the candidates' grasp of Confucian classics and their commitment to orthodoxy instead of any specialized technical realms of state administration. Functionaries, on the other hand, were specialized technical and clerical professionals who kept government routines going at all levels. Under the general supervision of far less specialized civil officials. As Charles Hucker points out, in Ming times, functionaries were numerous and had great influence in government, especially in regional and local units of administration where officials were few and often ignorant of local customs. Further, thousands of men through the functionary channel fill the lower ranks of officialdom. There are exceptions. By the way, here I just show you this minister and vice ministers of rights. There are exceptions to this general portrait of civil officials and functionaries. Among the several autonomous service agencies in the central government, other than the 6 militaries, were the Director for Astronomy, Qing Tianjian, and the Imperial Academy of Medicine, Taiyuan. The former was staffed largely by hereditary professional astrologers, whereas the latter was manned by imperial physicians, Yuyi, who often inherited the role or were selected from a social class of hereditary physicians. So civil servants of the Ming state included both those with ideological merit demonstrated through imperial examinations, as in the case of civil officials proper, and those with specialized professional knowledge like imperial astronomer, astrologer, imperial physicians, and functionaries. Now, those priests staffed divine music abbey, controlled the court of imperial sacrifices, and even penetrated the Minister of Rights with their professional knowledge of ritual. If the Daoist musicians and dancers in the divine music abbey, the court of imperial sacrifices, and the princely courts are comparable to functionaries at the various levels of administrative units, then the Daoist priests who served as officials in the court of imperial sacrifices and who were appointed ministers and vice ministers of rights would be the counterpart of imperial astronomer, astrologers, and imperial physicians. It has been taken for granted that the Confucian literati who passed the highest level of the imperial examinations were the sole candidates for membership in the civil officialdom in the Ming. The presence of Daoists in the Ministry of Rights, however, should alert us to the fact that this is a simplistic understanding of the reigning of the Ming government. In the Ming dynasty, the Ministry of Rights was in charge of administering religions with the Ministry of Rights. Within the Ministry of Rights, the Bureau of Sacrifices, was in charge with arranging sacrificial rituals in conjunction with the Court of Imperial Sacrifices. It has also had the mission of testing the Daoist novices seeking the state-issued clerical license known as the ordination certificate, 度牒, and the Daoist officers for state Daoist positions. The Central Daoist Registrar, 道路司, was another agency under the general supervision of the ministry, responsible for certifying and disciplining Daoists throughout the empire. Its staff were most senior priests of the capital monasteries or court clerics recommended by the Heavenly Master, who were recognized by state as a leader of the empire-wide Daoist clergy. The Court of Imperial Sacrifices was a prestigious agency at the court responsible for major state sacrificial ceremony carried out according to the ritual regulation prescribed by the Minister of Rights, and thus indirectly subordinate to the ministry. the court of imperial sacrifices control two types of state ritual institution staffed with Daoist clerics: the divine music abbey and a cluster of imperial mausoleums and state altar. Institutionally, the state agencies that perform state ritual were the court of imperial sacrifices and the central Daoist register, although occasionally the central Buddhist register, Senglu, is the Buddhist counterpart of the central Daoist register, and the Buddhist Great Xinguo Monastery were also involved in state ritual on an ad hoc basis. However, according to Tim Brooke, after 1380, with the late Hongwu reorganization, Buddhism was ruled out of playing any role in the composition of public authority, ideological or otherwise. In this sense, Daoism became more relevant in this period. Therefore, the court of imperial sacrifices and the central Daoist literature are particularly germane to the study of Daoist engagement with state ritual.
5 or 6 more minutes. 5 or 6 more minutes. Yeah. 5 or 6.
Okay. Yeah. So Daoist priests known as musician, dancers, 乐舞生, staffed and controlled these various state ritual agency. So I just listed the official positions here. These positions were almost all filled by Daoist musician dancers. So now I switch from here. I switch to Daoist lineage. So there are several, many Daoist lineages. The lineage I focus is on Liu Yuanran, the early Ming Daoist master Liu Yuanran and his lineage. And this lineage, Liu Yuanran and his disciples manipulate, monopolize the state ritual agency to the end of the Ming. So we may ask why. So actually, we can see these are all Liu Yuanran's disciples. And by the way, the information on these priests are all from steles. I didn't have time to prepare the image of stele, but we all know the shape of steles. So many works on the history of Daoism in treating Ming Daoism either focus on certain emperors' personal patronage of some individual priests or study the thought of some Daoist masters. Such an approach with regard to the behavior of some emperor or the luckily surviving works by these masters are simply historical contingency. What interests us is the role that Daoism consistently played in the Ming court and state institution, and furthermore, the formation of its operable pattern. In other words, its institutionalization. No matter whether a certain emperor patronized Daoism, and no matter whether a Daoist master left his Daoist work, such institutionalized role and the function of Daoism was profound. This is what is lacking in the works on Ming history. Even though certain emperors favor some individual Daoist priests, this kind of individual action had limited impact on overall Daoist role in the imperial institutions, for the emperor did not necessarily know or appoint Daoist officers one by one. The standard Confucian selection system for civil servants, that is the civil service examination itself, could not satisfy the needs of the relevant governmental agency that requires strong specialty and skills in ritual. Thus, we need to see this issue from the angle of the Daoism per se. The Daoist lineage is such a mechanism. This paper discussed the monopoly and control of the Ming state ritual institutions by the Liu Yuanran lineage. Moreover, through mass disciple or fellow disciple tie, the lineage generation by generation reproduced its presence in the Ming state institution and took effect. This approach to study of Ming Daoism departs completely from the conventional paradigm of the history of Daoism. Even Daoism as state can be understood from the lineage perspective. The central state Daoist offices were dominated by several lineages, as I just mentioned, including Liu Yuanran's lineage. This is also relate to the function and the role of biological lineages in Chinese history in late imperial and modern times. As noted, the astronomer, astrologer, and imperial physicians of the Directorate of Astronomy and the Imperial Academy of Medicine came from hereditary astronomer, astrologer, and physician families. In fact, functionary in government agencies were also largely hereditary. The Daoist priests who had official position in the Ming state ritual offices were also the case. Their knowledge and skill of ritual came from such lineage as Daoist, as the Daoist lineage Fa Pai, although the lineage here was no longer blood kinship, but a religious lineage or Dharma lineage called by Zhang Xuesong in his treatment of Buddhism. It is the reproduction ability of its religious lineages that these Daoist priests were able to monopolize the official position in the Ming state ritual institutions and continuously provide the ritual service to the state. This situation is similar to the composition of the officials and staff in the Directorate of Astronomy and the Imperial Academy of Medicine. In this sense, we need to further explore why it was Liu Yuanran and his Qingwei lineage, the pure tenacious lineage, rather than other school or lineage, for example, Quanzhen, who was able to monopolize the state ritual institution of the Ming. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much. Wonderful. I've received a couple messages just for some people that came in late. If you have questions or they're brewing in your head and you want to get them onto virtual paper, there is a Q&A tab that you can use to start submitting questions. So after our final speaker, we'll have a Q&A session. So feel free to go ahead and put those questions in now. So our last speaker, I mean, all three of our speakers are great luminaries. One of the great parts about this project is the Sino-US collaboration between China and the United States. And Dr. Lei Wen of Beijing Normal University will be our third speaker to round out our talks on Daoist epigraphy. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Gail, and all the friends from the University of Hawaii. It's a great honor to be here to attend the webinar to introduce something about my recent work on the Daoism of Tang Dynasty. My topic today is the monastery of Dark Capital, the famous Xuanduguan in Chang'an during the Sui and Tang era, focusing on the epigraphic sources. The Sui and the early Tang dynasty were very important turning points in the development of Daoism. On the one hand, Daoism developed from mountains to the urban area. On the other hand, the Daoist organization system changed from 24 parishes of way of the celestial masters to the state-sponsored monasteries. The Sui dynasty played a very key role in these changes. We can know that there were 10 Daoist temples in the capital Daxing city during the reign of Emperor Yangdi. Among them were 8 Daoist temples and 2 women's monasteries. Here is a outline of the 10 monasteries, and we can see the details. And this is a map of Chang'an. We can see the 10 the sides of the 10 temples, and the Xuanduguan is very big in this area. Of course, Xuanduguan was undoubtedly the most important Daoist temple in the capital of Sui dynasty and still play a very important role in Chang'an during the Tang. We knew very little about Xuanduguan before. But with the discovery of some new stone inscriptions, especially some important epitaphs, our understanding of the Xuanduguan had deepened a lot. First, I will introduce the epitaph of Li Pi and Xuanduguan in the Sui. The predecessor of Xuanduguan was the Daoist academic center of the Northern Zhou dynasty, Tong Daoguan. When the new capital was built in second year of reign of Emperor Wen, it moved directly from the old Chang city and changed its name. The official history states that Sui emperors ignored Daoism, but other materials show a different picture. According to the records of Yunji Qiqian, the first abbot of Xuanduguan, Wang Yan, was deeply respected by Emperor Wen. He collected and revised over 8,000 volumes of Daoist scriptures, which laid a solid foundation for the famous library of Xuanduguan. We can see the life of the ordinary Daoists from some newly discovered epitaphs. For example, the epitaph of Li Pi was found in the southern suburb of Xi'an in 2004. Li Pi had been a Daoist in Xuanduguan for over 30 years and returned to the secular life at the age of 46. Here is a rubbing of Li Pi. And here is the full text. It's a long text. We can see that Li Pi was born in a Li family of Yongle, Shanxi province, which is a very famous Daoist family in the Northern Zhou, Sui, and Tang dynasties. In 5996, at the age of 14, Li Pi entered Xuanduguan and had been a Daoist there for more than 30 years. Li returned to the secular life in 628, but he has maintained many Daoist habits. After his death, the famous Daoist Wang Kui asked somebody to write the epitaph for him. According to Daoxuan, Wang Kui was one of the most eminent Daoists in Chang'an and has close contact with Fu Yi, who is famous for his anti-Buddhist attitude. Li Pi and Wang Kui were friends, which is naturally related to his 30 years of Daoist career in Xuanduguan. Here's a Dunhuang manuscripts have the Xuanduguan in this manuscript. With time limited, I don't need to introduce it. Let's move to the second epitaph of Xuanduguan, Niu Hongman. Epitaph of Niu Hongman and the Xuanduguan in the early Tang. In 1972, the epitaph of Niu Hongman, he is the first abbot of Xuanduguan in the Tang, was unearthed in the southern suburb of Xi'an. This is a cover, and this is the rubbing of the epitaph of Niu Hongman. This full text is a very, very long and provides so many informations. In short, in 614, when Niu Hongman was 17 years old, he left his home and entered Xuanduguan to be a Daoist. In the following years, he has traveled around famous mountains and visited scenic spots, which was also a common way to promote cultivation for the Daoists of Tang. The epitaph shows that Niu Hongman often visited the court and had the official title of Chao San Da Kai Fu Yi Tong San Si, which means he had a very high political status. The most powerful sponsor of Niu Hongman is Li Boyi, the nephew of the first emperor, the founder of Tang Dynasty, Gaozu. Boyi had a very poor image in the official history record, but news epitaphs simulated him with the famous princes such as Liu An and Cao Zhi. We can understand that because Boyi was the most important supporter for Niu and Xuanduguan at that time. Our third epitaph is Yin Jingchong and Xuanduguan in the High Tang. It's a very important discovery. In 2002, say the last year, the epitaph of Yin Jingchong, the abbot of the Xuanduguan in High Tang, was published, which was probably the most important discovery in recent years. This epitaph can shed a new light on the Daoism in the High Tang, especially on the construction of Xuanduguan. This is Rabin, and this is a text. Yeah, it's also a very long text. Like Niu Hongman, Yin Jingchong also became a Daoist in Xuanduguan at the age of 13. He was a disciple of Cheng Xuanying, the famous Daoist master of the Chongxuan school in the early Tang. According to the epitaph, Yin Jingchong was respected by Emperor Gaozong, Empress Wu Zetian, Emperor Zhongzong and Xuanzong, and was closely related to the two sisters of Xuanzong, Princess Jinxian and Princess Yuzhen. He not only helped the two princesses to enter the Daoism, but also made outstanding contributions to the construction of the Xuanduguan. This is a very important synthesis in this text concerning about the buildings of Xuanduguan. Although the construction of Xuanduguan were splendid when it's building, there was no meditation hall for 130 years. Yin Jingchong built a meditation hall at Xuanduguan, which might reflect the new changes in the way of monasteryism in the town. That is, while building large national-sponsored monasteries in the city and make Daoists gather together, it also needs to be combined with the old Daoist tradition of quiet room, Jingshi. Our last epitaph is Zhang, Zheng Juzhong and the Xuanduguan in the last Tang, in the late Tang. Of course, Xuanduguan still maintains some official color after the An Lushan rebellion, and the Daoists in it continue to serve as envoys for the court. For example, we can say Wang Duanjing, the abbot of Xuanduguan, and the eunuch Wei Chengxin went to Zhang Gongdong in Changzhou to cast the dragon ceremony, as well as that in the Mount Tai, this is Daiyue Guanbei, the inscriptions on that. And Zheng Juzhong, this is, we can get the Rabin a picture of the epitaph, but we just know the texts. We can say Zheng Juzhong was born in a Daoist family. He became a Daoist in Xuanduguan from his childhood. Later, he returned to the secular life and learned Confucianism. He passed the imperial examination and became a high-rank official later. However, he kept his faith in Daoism all his life. He also got a register of highest clarity and made friends with many Daoists. Here, this is the text of the epitaph. We can learn that before his death in 837, he went to the Wangwu Mountain and Songshan Mountain to visit the monasteries there. He even predicted the date of his death. So Zheng's experience was recorded as a legend by the people at that time and included in a legend collection, Yishi. Its details can be referenced with the epitaph. So we can learn that in general, Xuandu Guan lost his previous glory in the mid and late Tang. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Wonderful. So again, the Q&A, the question and answer tab at the bottom is the best way to submit questions for our presenters. Here in a second, I can pose it to them. But before we do question and answers, I wanted to give time to the three members of this research team to just a few minutes if there's anything kind of big bullet points that may have been missed, or kind of like just a time to emphasize as the these three papers, or maybe other parts of the research project they have going on, just kind of some of the big discoveries or things that may have not have come out in the presentations. If any of you want to kind of address those for a couple minutes.
I think the main point, and I think both Richard and Lei Wen kind of pointed out, is that using these materials, we get different visions of Daoism in different times of history, different locations. So in Richard's case, you can reconstruct many more of the networks by using the various inscriptions that he's working with to actually construct all these various networks that he was discussing. That if you just look at the texts as presented are just absent from there. Or in Lei Wen's case, this is a very small example, but he's done many similar examinations of epitaphs, and you really get far more fleshed out of the social history of Daoism during this particular case during the Tang, which temples they go to, and so on. Or in what I was presenting, you can reconstruct the lives of sometimes very small families, sometimes very large clans, but you can sort of work through some of the details of what they were actually interested in and who they were, and visions you just don't understand. In some of these cases, especially in the cases I was discussing, the actual practice of making statues seems to sort of run counter to what the texts actually tell us. So it fills in a gap that cannot actually be explained at all in texts. You sort of have to say, well, why suddenly in the Tang do they begin to make statues? There's no kind of real textual basis for that. So they're picking it up from the local practice, and it becomes orthodox, right? So that, I think, is a very important point. So a lot of these works introduce elements that are completely unknown, or in fact running counter sometimes to what we think of when we just work with textual sources.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
Richard,
I would like to follow up. As in Lei Wen's case, the epitaph for Mu Zhiming are so important to reveal the social history, right? The social history of these Daoists and the Xuandu Guan, right? And in my case as well, because other sources we don't know, but in my case, the stele, the Miaobei, right? The temple steles, this kind of steles, basically, from these steles, you know their relationship, that they belong to a certain lineage, or so they honor a certain master, so belong to that particular lineage. But also that kind of lineage identity was so strong. So whenever they recommend somebody to ritual, state ritual office, they always recommend member of their own lineage. So I said this kind of information can only, in my case, can only get from that kind of sources, traditional sources, non-textual source. Of course, they are also textual, right? But not the conventional sources.
Anything to add? Is it?
Yeah, in recent years, I pay much attention to the epitaphs, rabbins of Tang Dynasty, and in recent years, more and more epitaphs were discovered in recent years, and really, it's shed new light on the history of Tang Daoism. So in fact, I pay much attention to the Daoist of the capital of the two capitals of Tang dynasty, Tang and Luoyang. And before we know very little about the Daoists in these monasteries and the space construction. Yeah, it's a holy space, but we knew very little about that. So with the epitaphs discovery, we can learn much about that. So I think it's the epitaphs, of course, and a lot of previous discovered steles were very important for our understanding of Tang Daoism. Yeah. So in Gail's project, we can learn. I can learn much new ways to understand the maybe improve my method of the Daoist study. Yeah, new understanding maybe.
Great. Yeah. Well, I see questions are already pouring into the Q&A tab. That's wonderful. Keep them rolling in. Maybe I'll follow up with what all three presenters just talked about and kind of ask a quick question on my own, and then we'll move on to the question and answers in the tab.